Welcome to today's lecture, and welcome Mildura and Shepparton as well. Today I want to give you some context to the Mile Creek Massacre. We're discussing that this week as a way in of discussing frontier violence, and I'm going to talk about the wider context of the Mile Creek Massacre and also about the wider context of violence and how historians in recent times have been brought back into an argument about frontier violence, which was actually part of the historiography of about 30 years ago, but it has been revived in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, I want to begin by talking about two opposing forces in colonial land policy. Now, firstly, as I think we've discussed before, there was an aspiration by the British to recreate themselves in the New World, that they were going to supplant Indigenous societies and recreate the agricultural hierarchical society of England. And this was the aspiration of the leaders of the British government and the elites of Britain, and I guess they saw it as a place for their younger sons to flourish, because as you know, the laws of primogeniture meant that only the oldest son inherited the landed wealth in England, so there had to be something found for the other sons, either the army, the church, or if new colonial fields of expansion could be found, then there would be places for those younger sons. But of course, this had to face the reality of the Australian landscape. You know, the Australian landscape, since its emergence 40 million years ago as Gondwanaland, has been declining into aridity, and it's now the most arid of continents. So could this most arid of continents give birth to the English vision of a landed agricultural society? And it seems that in the early years of the colony there was a search for a viable economic staple. Was it to be found at sea? They tried killing whales, they tried killing seals for their pelts, and eventually was so successful that they farmed out those areas. They tried trade in the Pacific area, and then they looked to agriculture, but there was a lack of suitable soils. So inevitably, people started to experiment with sheep, and that meant a pastoral economy, a much more extensive economy than a closely settled agricultural one. And you can see the disjunction that arises in policy and reality in the two maps that follow. And of course, what I'm saying here, of course, leaves out the fact that Aboriginal people they're not seen to be players. They're left out of the whole equation. So let's look at these two maps. First of all, you have on the left a map which shows what are called the limits of location. This area here. This is out beyond Bathurst, so beyond the Blue Mountains, but not too far beyond Bathurst. And this was decreed by the government that there would be no settlement beyond this area. And this was because they were trying to confine the settlement and to make it like Mother England. But of course the reality was that this was a map by the mid-1830s of the squatting districts of New South Wales. So squatting had taken European occupation way beyond the limits of location which are there to this area here, down into Victoria by 1835, the end of 1835, and up into the southern parts of Queensland by the end of the 1830s. So this was the aspiration and this was the reality. So I want to talk a little bit more about those two things. And if I just go back a moment, we're talking about the Mile Creek massacres this week, which is up there. So way beyond the limits of location. So I've already talked a little bit about the aspiration of the limits of location. I suppose one of the chief designers of this policy was a man called Edward Wakefield. He wrote a letter from Sydney in 1829. He didn't actually write it from Sydney because he was in jail at the time. This man had a penchant for running away with young heiresses, which he tried to marry for their fortune. But the second time he tried it, he was caught in France and hauled back by the father and the family and thrown into jail for abduction of this young woman. While he was in jail, he thought about colonies, and he was a very, very bright man. And I suppose the easy way to wealth is to marry into it. If you can't find someone to agree with you, then you just sort of use a little pressure and your charisma and you abduct this young lady. So while he was there, he wrote this article which argued that the way to make colonies like England, and that was his aspiration too, was to confine settlement and to confine the sale of land. The problem with the New World was that land was too easily available. Anyone could get it. People that weren't respectable, weren't special in terms of class terms, they could get land, and therefore they could create a society which was unlike England, where only the well-bred and the gentry held the land. So the way to stop this was to sell land, but to sell it at what he referred to as a sufficient price. Now, he never actually said what this sufficient price was, but he defined it in the sense that it had to be a price sufficient to stop the riff-raff getting hold of it. So only those with money could buy land if the price was set high enough. And therefore, when people came to these new lands, they had to actually work for someone else. And that was then going to create the society like England. So you would have a master group and a whole lot of labourers and servants working for them. And so influential was Wakefield, even though he was persona non grata with the British gentry and government because he was an abductor of heiresses, but they listened to his ideas. He was a backroom boy in the history of colonisation. So his ideas of selling land were adopted in 1831 because up to that time, land was given away by the governor to either his friends, people who'd done good works for the empire, or little bits were given to convicts to keep them in the colony. So that was the vision behind the limits of location. The reality was, of course, different, as I said. And what was happening was that people started to realise that in Australia's poor soils, they seemed to be good for growing sheep. At first they experimented with sheep for mutton, but of course there was only a limited market. How could you ship your sheep's carcasses? That was a tough one. How could you ship your sheep's carcasses overseas without refrigeration? They didn't have it till the 1870s. So you could only grow so much mutton to sell. You could salt it down, etc., perhaps, but they came to see that the real destiny lay in what was on the sheep's back, the wool. And so they started to experiment with wool varieties. Merinos were imported. There's a great story about that because there was an embargo on the exportation of merinos from Spain, but the ones that came to Australia got through gifts between the royal families of England and Spain, and then those sheep eventually, some of them made their way here. So the sheep that was sent off started to win some medals in the period just after the Napoleonic Wars, and people recognised that there was great prospects here. And then in 1823, the United Kingdom reduced the export duties on Australian wool and retained them on German wool, because German wool was the up-and-coming wool-growing nation. You can see in this rather distorted pie chart here, this was the Spain holding most of the wool production by 1810, but as other countries got access to the merino and other varieties, then Germany became the powerhouse. But very quickly, Australia starts to emerge, and by 1850, Australia got half of the imports of Britain to the woolen manufacturers. So that decision to give Australian wool preference meant that there was an open market. And of course, wool was perfect for Australia because you could grow fine wools up the country and you could drag them down on a huge wool dray through muddy roads and trackless plains, put them on a ship, get them across the world, and they could still have value. You could never sell any other export like that because it would have been too heavy. But wool was light, you could pack an enormous amount on a wool dray and on a ship and get a high value for it. So very quickly you can see that Australia becomes dominant in the wool market. Now, of course, this led to a massive pastoral expansion. And here you see a picture of some young adventurers having a cup of tea outside their tent, just about to go off with a mob of sheep to select a sheep run. And so there was a massive expansion of settlement across the limits of location, which of course was illegal. And it led to a massive concentration of land holding. I've talked to you about the land holding of Britain being a concentration in the hands of a few, but really Australia achieved something like an 80-fold intensity of that, because something like 1,000 pastoralists hold all the land under pastoral occupation, not ownership, from the sort of southern part of Australia, South Australia, edge of South Australia, Victoria, right up to Queensland, all that, and over to the Darling. Much of that land is held by pastoralists, 1,000 of them, and that's something like 12 times the size of England. So the intensity of land holding was 80 times that of England, which was bad enough. Now, the thing was that these people were called squatters. And what does that mean? Well, it meant they were illegal land holders. They just simply went and squatted on the land and tried to call it theirs. So it was an illegal occupation. This was illegal because land was not being sold beyond the limits of location. People were not even supposed to be there. And the thing was that the squatters wanted to do this because they didn't have the initial capital to buy the land they needed. Land at this time was selling at £1 an acre. That's what the price that had been set in 1831. So if you wanted, say, 5,000 or 10,000 acres to run sheep, that was going to cost an enormous amount of money. And even the start-up costs for a pastoral settlement could be something like £5,000 over the first couple of years. And remember, shepherds were earning maybe £25 a year. So we're looking at an enormous amount of money to get a pastoral property going, to take your sheep out, get started, build all the equipment you need, and wait 1 or 2 years for that first wool check to come back. So the prospect of buying land too was just beyond them. So that's why they just pushed out and settled illegally. And this leads to the squatters having a poor image. Most people in these first years in the 1830s thought that the squatters were a criminal element. And some of them were, and some of them actually stocked their first sheep runs with someone else's sheep. They rustled them, they stole a few, they pushed out beyond the law, beyond the boundaries, and just went ahead and tried to grow sheep. So they've got a poor image at first, but as more and more people get into squatting, the respectable landowners around Sydney start to think, hey, we're missing out on this, and they start to get involved in squatting ventures as well. So that means you have a crossover between landowners and squatters, and there's a growing respectability coming out of that for the squatters. Now what this leads to is a very significant battle for the land. Again, one which leaves Aboriginal people out of the picture. It's a battle between the squatters and the government over what should happen. And the arguments that both put are very interesting. The squatters basically put an argument in their claims for ownership of the land that was revolved around the squatters' theory of value. That is, they said they were making wasteland productive. They were doing what God had said in the Bible, to go forth and multiply and make the world productive. So they used the Bible as a support for what they were doing. they claim the rights of pioneers. We are the ones doing the hard work. We're out there making this country pay, using the land and progressing the colony. So they argued they were the wealth creators, that, you know, all the colonial exports by the 1830s are being dominated by wool, and so they were therefore the rightful prime stakeholders of the colony. And they should have a right to purchase land freehold, but not at £1 an acre. They wanted something far lower. And some of them even said, look, we shouldn't have to purchase the land. We're making it productive. We should have it. The government's view, of course, was that the Crown owned the land, and this was through the Act of Possession in 1770. The government, of course, followed the Wakefieldian vision of a concentrated settlement to create a controlled and organised society. And they said that the squatters were using the Crown land free, and that couldn't be tolerated, that the Crown had to get a return for its ownership of these acres. Governor Burke, who was a Liberal, had come out in the early 1830s, faced with this situation, came up with a pragmatic decision. So what he agreed that the squatters were verging on barbarism at times. They were uncontrolled, they were illegal settlers, but he also saw that the future of the colony lay in their hands economically. So his pragmatic compromise was that they should be given licences, and this was in 1836. So for £10, which is not much, probably half the yearly wage of one shepherd, maybe in today's terms about $20,000. For $20,000 they could have a licence for 1 year to hold as much land as they could hold. And so it was a pretty good deal, and the squatters went quiet for a while. And he put into place Crown Lands Commissioners. These were government men who would journey round and they would make compromises excuse me, with the squatters, because the squatters were actually jostling with each other for where their boundaries were, and there were a lot of disputes, etc. So the Crown Lands Commissioner would come in, settle the boundary disputes, make a pronunciation about it, and then collect the £10 licence fee. So it was a way of ending the chaos of a sort of a rampant grab for the land. Now in the 1840s there was a sort of stage 2 to the land struggle, and Governor Gipps was the new governor. He came determined to bring the squatters to heel. He feared that in the future the squatters would hold a monopoly of the land, which is not what the government wanted. He was still against that vision of an agricultural, British-like society. And he was worried by the fact that the government was not getting much return through this compromise of Burke of the £10 licence. There was something like $7,000 per annum coming in licence fees, but this was for all the land in the southeast of Australia. Something like a huge amount of land was bringing only a return of about 2% per annum on the alleged value of that land. So it wasn't a very good deal for the Crown, and Gipps wanted to change that. What unfolded in the 1840s was some of the most bitter attacks between a governor and the elite of the colony, because in the New South Wales Legislative Council, the squatters did have positions in the council. It was a council peopled by large landowners. So there was a bitter struggle in the council, so much so that there was very vindictive things said, scurrilous things said about the governor by these squatters and their friends. And some of the most eminent people in the colony were involved in squatting at this time, and the squatters were led by William Charles Wentworth, who was the prime native-born settler. He was the first native-born settler in the colony, son of a convict. He was educated at Oxford, he'd written books, he pioneered the free press in the 1820s, and he led the squatters in their attack on the government. Gibbs had to eventually compromise with them because he also saw that they were the economic wealth of the colony, and if they remained in an insecure one-year lease situation, barbarism would continue. So if the British government wanted to end this barbarism, it had to give them a greater tenure on the land, so they would build more permanent houses, they would bring wives and families onto the land with them. So there'd been a number of compromises, and finally a compromise was put in place by the British government under Earl Grey's Waste Land Act. What this did was gave the squatters long leases, 1 year when they were close into settlement, but up to 14 years when they were on the far reaches of settlement. These leases were cheap. They had to pay £10, not for all the land they could hold as before, but for every 400 sheep they had. Most settlers would have had maybe 4,000 or 5,000 sheep, so they were probably paying 5 times what they were paying before, but it was still pretty cheap. You know, maybe for 50 or £100, equal to a couple of their shepherd's wages, they would hold a large amount of land. And they also had the right to purchase that land at £1 an acre if it ever came up for sale. So the squatters were quite jubilant by this decision. But Earl Grey also put a very important clause into place which gave Indigenous people some rights to land. And this is, I think, because of the strength of the humanitarian influence in the British government at this time, of which I'll say more about next week. So Crown leases of land were to hold mutual rights. That is, that Aboriginal people had rights to gather subsistence from the land, except on pieces of land that were fenced or that were tilled with agriculture, cultivated land. And Aboriginal reserves were also to be created. Now these were to be places of social change where Aboriginal people themselves would be taught to become yeoman farmers and to till the soil. But he was giving them, as original owners, some access to land and some rights in land. Now the outcome of this was that all this was to be put into place over the next few years. The land was to be surveyed and reserves were to be set up. But what happened was that, first of all, the squatters resisted some of these reforms. They weren't happy about Aboriginal reserves being dotted around the place. And also the gold rushes that emerged in 1851 overtook the whole process of surveying, and all the pastoral lease surveying had to be set aside because it was much more important to survey the gold fields because there were thousands of men descending from overseas and other colonies onto the gold fields, and they had to be managed first. So in effect, the squatters never did get their leases, although they gained a tacit right to have these more permanent leases. And out of this came some Aboriginal reserves, and there's an image here, might be a bit hard to see, but this is actually of Victoria, and this was a decision put in place by the local Governor of Victoria, La Trobe, of which our university is named after. And La Trobe, following the 1848 Waste Land Act, put into place a whole lot of important allocations of land for water reserves, Aboriginal reserves, mineral reserves and townships. And he had a sense of vision. He didn't want the squatters to grab all the land. He wanted some of it to be kept for the people in the future. So he located all these new townships which didn't even exist on the map, and there was a lot of squatter anger about La Trobe, but he's a man of great vision for the future of the colony and the people of the colony, not wanting it just to fall into the hands of a few. And the same thing, of course, happened in New South Wales. Now, of course, after this political decision was made, there was an emerging struggle for the land between Aboriginal people and settlers. And in many areas at first, there was not outright conflict, but some uneasy meetings and encounters. There was a wary approach. Often deals were struck about Aboriginal people working initially on the property, gathering bark, helping the shelters to be built. And Aboriginal people also tried to establish kinship connections with the settlers because they could get access to food, because they were absolutely amazed by 10,000 mutton chops coming over the horizon in the hands of a few people on their land, and they thought they could get access to some of that. But of course, inevitably, their desire to try some of those mutton chops led to misunderstandings, led to some conflict, and usually these were at first feuds between particular Aboriginal people and particular settlers who they thought had wronged them or hadn't made the payments for the use of women or whatever that they thought they had contracted. But eventually, I think Aboriginal people came to see it as a much wider struggle. And we have in the records Aboriginal people yelling to people, "We want all you whites out. We want all you white bastards out of here." They picked up the language pretty quickly. And so that they were universalising the struggle. It wasn't then, "We want you particular person out because you've wronged us," but they started talking about all the settlers as a group. And I think that's a shift in their traditional thinking from feud-based struggle to the notion of war. And certainly on the other side of the equation, the settlers used the term war, and they talked about a black war being evident on the frontier in the 1840s. Now that war was fairly universal in the sense that most areas were touched by some sort of armed struggle, but the degree of that was very varied, and it depended upon local factors. The state of the Aboriginal population, the numbers, perhaps whether disease had been evident there to reduce numbers or not. Factors like terrain were very important. Down in the Western District, for instance, in the scoria country of that's the volcanic rock that lays on the surface, you'll know, way down the Western District, there were parts of the country down there that was inaccessible to horses. And so Europeans couldn't get into that area easily with horses, and Aboriginal people tended to have a natural place to take refuge. And so when there were mountain areas or others, that terrain meant that the resistance might go on for several years. Where it was open country, often the resistance might last only weeks or months. And then there might be a decisive action, and then Aboriginal people would basically sue for peace, knowing that they were outgunned, outnumbered. And of course, in some areas the government used the military or the border police. Other areas, vigilantes were used in punitive expeditions got up by local settlers against local Aboriginal people. Eventually, of course, in each area, Aboriginal people were overwhelmed because they fought on a group by group or tribe by tribe basis. They didn't, I think, in the era of conflict, forge many alliances, or if any alliances, between groups to fight the Europeans. So it tended to be each group against the border police or the settlers or the British military. And in some of those engagements, they're quite severe. In Bathurst in the 1820s, martial law was introduced for several months, which is the right to shoot on sight, and that was used against Aboriginal people in the Bathurst area with great effect. So the face of battle could be quite sporadic. Things ramped up, calmed down again. Often it was an intimate encounter because people on both sides knew each other's names. Aboriginal people knew the settlers' names, and the settlers knew who were the troublemakers in the area. But sometimes, disconcertingly, they were people who might have worked on the station for a couple of weeks or a month, helping out around, and then they would resort to violence. So the whites couldn't understand this. Obviously, the people were perhaps the Europeans were falling foul of kinship obligations or understandings, but they read it as treachery. So that these encounters were on and off, brutal, and often had the intimacy of knowing who they were up against. Sometimes I think, as we'll be talking this week, we can say that these encounters were massacres, as in the Mile Creek Massacre. And there were massacres on the other side. There was one up near Benalla, present-day Benalla, which is called the Faithful Massacre, where about 8 or 9 shepherds were killed by Aboriginal warriors. So there were these large-scale killings, and I think by massacre we imply the killings of defenceless people or beaten people who are still killed. But I think we can overuse the word massacre, and some of what was going on were just military defeats by one side or the other. And because I think if we overuse the word massacre when talking about frontier violence, we pose either side as victims. You know, we pose Aboriginal people as victims sitting around waiting to be killed by Europeans, and that wasn't the case. But sometimes they got into situations where they were unable to escape, and Europeans sometimes kept pressing them, and we can certainly call those a massacre. But I would hope that we don't overuse that term and just throw it around like that. Often what you have on the frontier is restraint. And Aboriginal people and Europeans, people on both sides, sometimes only went so far and didn't push on to violence. They found a way through it, or they avoided it. So again, that's important to recognise. We need also to recognise about the weaponry in this warfare. And one of the things is that the guns that were being used on the frontier were not very efficient. They were in the pre-1850 period at least, and the northern frontier I think is different, but in the southeast frontier we're talking about at the moment, the guns were smoothbore flintlock weapons. That means that they had to be loaded through this sort of mechanism at the top of the gun, and that required taking some powder and placing it, well, first of all you would load the barrel. What you did was you inverted the gun and you put powder, wadding and a ball down in there and rammed it down nice and tight, and then you put some powder in the pan up here, and you had a flintstone up here, and when you pressed the trigger, this came down here and dropped a spark onto that powder, which made a charge through the barrel and set off the main charge. That's how they worked. And they had to be smooth bored, because when you're ramming stuff down, you couldn't have rifling. Now the implications of this they were very inefficient weapons. They took about 30 seconds for an expert to load. Because they were smooth bored, when they were fired, they could only hit something accurately at about 70 metres. Beyond 70 metres, because they were finding round lead bullets, they tended to drift off after a while, whereas a modern bullet is rifled and it's a projectile shape, and it spins as it goes and it keeps its accuracy. So these were slow to load. The firing mechanism was also very unreliable, because misfires happened about 1 in 6 in military tests of the day. So people who knew how to load weapons efficiently and expertly still had misfires of 1 to 6. And you've heard the old adage, it was just a flash in the pan. That's what that means, because sometimes the first charge would go off but the second charge would not. In fact, when Governor Phillip gets speared, in early Sydney, that we've read about last week, the sailors rushed to their boat, they picked up their muskets and fired, and they all failed to fire because they'd been wet on the trip across the harbour. So these were very inefficient weapons. On the other hand, Aboriginal weaponry was quite efficient because spears had been thrown by young boys and girls, I would think, in play from the ages of about 4 or 5. And you saw in the video last week 2 young children, before the convicts are discovered on the beach, are rolling a disc along the ground and throwing their spears at it. So these people were very practiced at spear throwing, and of course spears could be thrown much more rapidly than a gun could be fired. And there are stories of men trying to reload their guns and getting 2 spears in the thigh from 70 yards off by someone throwing. So what I think we need to recognise is that the frontier struggle in the pre-1850 period was much more even than we might imagine. Horses were not in great evidence because they were still rare items on the frontier. Most of the shepherds were on foot, and the weapons they had were probably evenly matched with the spear. The only thing that was different, I think, was when bullets hit a body, they made a much more massive impact because they were travelling at about 5 times the speed of a spear, so they're harder to dodge. You can dodge spears and you can survive a spear wound, as did Philip, almost just near his jugular, he survived. But bullets tended, when they hit shoulders, to just smash the shoulder, and that would make post-recovery very difficult in an era when there were no hospitals or surgeons. So I think the wounds from guns were much more severe. Well, to focus in on the Liverpool Plains, again, this is New South Wales, these are the 19 counties, and that is the Mile Creek Station up there near present-day sort of Moree area. The Liverpool Plains were first explored in 1827 by Oxley. Squatters had penetrated there by the mid-1830s, where they met resistance from the Kamilaroi up in the Namoi, etc. Some stations were almost abandoned under the initial attacks of Aboriginal people, but settlers stayed, cattle were taken, and by 1837, 4 shepherds were killed in the area. So there are many incidents, and we'll be talking about the response to that in our tutorials, and also I'm going to show you a video of the Major Nun expedition and also the Mile Creek massacre events will be discussed in our tutorial. Now, there were many incidents in this area over this period of 1836 to 42, and the Mile Creek massacre was not the only action in the area, and there is evidence that there was a second Mile Creek massacre where 30 to 40 people were killed. Magistrate Day wrote to the 1839 Police and Jails Committee saying that it seemed that he explained that the whites seemed to feel that they were in an enemy's country and were afraid to move out of their huts without firearms. The Aborigines were repeatedly pursued by parties of mounted and armed stockmen assembled for the purpose, and that great numbers of them had been killed at various spots, particularly at Vinegar Hill, Slaughterhouse Creek and Gravesend, places so called by the stockmen in commemoration of the deeds enacted there. Reverend Threlkeld, also who lived at Lake Macquarie up in this area here, Reverend Threlkeld said in the period of the 1830s 15 whites and 500 blacks had been killed. Now, he wasn't an on-the-spot witness, he talked to people, and so we can't take his figures as accurate. But he did say there was a secret hostile process that has been encouraged and carried on against the blacks by a party of lawless Europeans until it gained confidence and unblushingly and openly appeared to the loss of upwards of 500 Aborigines within the last 2 years, including the numerous massacres of men, women and children. So certainly things were happening on the frontier. We can't take 500 deaths as gospel, but we know that there was a warfare happening. and the native police and the border police were sent to quell it. So let's talk about the numbers of casualties in the more general conflict, Cold War over the colonies. And how do we know? Well, the written evidence of this is massive. We have, as I've listed here, government commissions, dispatches and letters, settlers' letters, press accounts, diaries, etc., talking about the frontier violence and struggle. There are literally thousands of accounts from the southeast area. And sometimes people recorded the deaths in specific areas and their letters to the governor asking for something to be done about it, and they recorded stock losses. And John Forrest, who was a Premier of Western Australia, who was a minister in the first federal government after Federation, said to the Legislative Council in Western Australia in 1886, "We went amongst them with our sheep and our cattle, and we found them in an altogether uncivilised state and hostile, and we had to defend our lives and property, not by the strong arm of the law, but by force. That occurred on every station on the outskirts of civilisation in these colonies." So here's a minister of Western Australia admitting in Parliament that the rule of force was enacted on the frontier. He saw it as defending his property and his life against people who are uncivilised and hostile. So what then might have been the death tolls? Well, Australia-wide, possibly 20,000 Aboriginal people and 2,000 non-Indigenous people died. Now, how is this calculated? Well, they are at the start estimates, and we have to acknowledge that. Henry Reynolds in 1981 thought that maybe about 2,000 to 2,500 Europeans died in the struggle. In 1987 he said possibly 3,000. When I wrote my book in 1982, I suggested maybe up to 1,500 Europeans were killed. In 1988, in another article I wrote, The Struggle for Australia, I reiterated that. Now, how do we get to these tallies? Well, there are regional figures that are much more known, and people that have done work in Queensland think about 870 Europeans and their allies died. In Victoria, historians have said 59 Europeans were killed on the frontier. Tasmania, 176. These are very specific figures because inquests were carried out. Historians have trawled through the newspapers and recorded all the listed deaths. Western Australia, 83. But some of these areas, New South Wales, South Australia, Northern Territory, big areas, there is little work being done yet. But estimates may be these figures here. And so this is what I tried to do, tallying up to about 1,700 European deaths. But what do we know about Aboriginal deaths? And these are extremely difficult to know because there was a lack of reportage. There were no inquests taken on Aboriginal deaths, or maybe one or two, but very few inquests were held. Bodies were often removed by Aboriginal people after fighting, or in fact bodies were covered up by settlers. And you might see it, and we talk about that today in the Moral Creek Massacre. So that it's very difficult to know how many Aboriginal deaths there were, and of course when we talk about deaths we forget talking about the wounded and all the families left behind on both sides who have lost someone. But again, working from regional death ratios, some historians, some observers at the time made statements about how many Aboriginal people died compared to how many Europeans. And some of the ratios, except one statement by Michael Christie, which is way out of the ballpark of all the others, most of these are under or up to 10 to 1. 10 to 1 European deaths for every Aboriginal death. And so if we're going to make a guesstimate, that's probably about the best we can do. It's maybe reasonable to say that 10 Aboriginal people died to every one settler death in the fighting. So if we think that around about 1700 up to 2,500 Europeans died on the frontier, then maybe something like 20,000 Aboriginal deaths. And from what we know about the other evidence, this doesn't seem to be too large a figure. In fact, Henry Reynolds has recently argued that maybe it was much more than 20,000. And what's the cost of this war? Sociologist Peter Berger once wrote that all men are vultures in that they live off the agonies of the past. At the foundation of every historical society there are a vast pile of corpses, victims of the murderous acts that directly or indirectly led to the establishment of that society. There is no getting away from this point, and there is nothing to be done about it. It is an inevitable burden of the human condition. And if you think of the invasions that various places have experienced, the Anglo-Australian homeland of Britain has experienced successive invasions from the Romans 2,000 years ago through to the Norman conquest 1,000 years ago. So there's a succession of invasions, and this occurred in every country that you can just about think of. Plus, in the last 200 years, there's been imperial expansion by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British and other empires into the New World. So that the Australian situation is not unique, and we always need to see it in those terms. And we always need to perhaps make judgments about comparatively whether it was worse or better than some of these situations. But of course we also need to see it in its own terms, that is that 20,000, 2,000 or 200 deaths are always 200 too many. Now in recent times, let's move forward a bit now. In our own lifetime, in the last decade, the whole issue of the frontier wars has arisen again. And it has often been called the history wars. Now, as I told you in an earlier lecture, Aboriginal history arose in the 1970s and started to give a new version of the national story. That is, that there is an Aboriginal part of that story that has been excluded. And I think that the rise of Aboriginal history has inevitably led to a backlash. This, I think, began at the time of the bicentenary, when some people wanted to talk not only about the good things of Australia's past, but there had been some shameful things done. Prime Minister Keating was very interested in history, and in a number of speeches in the early 90s, he gave another view of history. He gave one notable speech about how the British government failed to back up Australia over the fall of Singapore. He gave speeches at the Year of Indigenous People, saying that that the early settlers had engaged in killing, removal of Aboriginal people from their land and taking of children. It was a very strong statement. And of course the Mabo judgment by the High Court in 1992 had actually quoted historians like Henry Reynolds on the issues of native title. So all this, I think, led to a backlash from conservative sections of the Australian community, and surprisingly perhaps attacks on the High Court over the Mabo decision, arguing that the High Court was being too adventurous, it was going ahead of public opinion, it was trying to act like a government, making policy rather than deciding on judicial issues. And it's quite an interesting thing for conservatives to attack the High Court, because the law is usually the last bastion of the conservatives' defence. So these led to a series of history or cultural wars, which were probably first begun in 1993 in Geoffrey Blainey, the historian, a very notable and very good historian, gave the Latham Lecture, in which he attacked what he called the black armband view of history. He argued that Australia had in many ways a proud history, and while it hadn't done well in every area, the black armband mournful view of Australia's past should not be given prominence. He argued that Australia had been a very progressive nation and it had developed the country as never before. He argued that we are the oldest democracy in the world and we should be proud of that. And the only thing he gave us a cross for, so he gave 2 ticks, or 2 cheers as he called it, and 1 boo was that we had abused the land. But he didn't want to mention what had been done with Aboriginal people. Now, John Howe embraced this view very strongly of this, this idea of rejecting the black armband. He wanted to attack what he called political correctness, which gave the green light to the growth of Hansonism. If any of you have much knowledge of Pauline Hanson and her One Nation Party, the Prime Minister in 1996, by giving the green light to throwing over any political correctness, opened the way for some strong statements about minorities from such as Pauline Hanson. And the Prime Minister wanted progress to be acknowledged, the good things in Australia's past, and he said he wanted us to be comfortable about our history, not ashamed or guilty. And this, I think, gave the green light to others to emerge, one of them being Keith Windschuttle, a historian of some standing early in his career, although more a social analyst thereafter. Windschuttle had already written a book called The Killing of History, which was an attack on what he saw as relativism and postmodernism in history. And he wanted to champion the view that the facts should be put and history should be unbiased. Now, Windschuttle then wrote 4 articles on the frontier violence in Quadrant in 2000. And these had an immediate impact. Windschuttle argued that frontier violence was exaggerated, and he even used the word fabricated, which was in effect challenging his fellow historians with lying, basically. He said that all the historians of Aboriginal history, their work was sloppy, or they were in collusion with each other to exaggerate the violence. It was really quite an amazing claim to claim that a whole body of people in different institutions right across the country were in collusion. But he made that claim and he didn't resolve from it. His view was that there was not large-scale violence on the frontier and that overall the British Empire was a good empire because it upheld the rule of law and quelled violence. I think behind Windschuttle's view was the view that Aboriginal people's destiny was assimilation, that he didn't have much sympathy with Aboriginal culture, he didn't understand it, he didn't want to research it or try and get inside the heads of Aboriginal people. He just believed that they should become like all the rest of us. And one of his attacks at the time also was against the National Museum and some of the exhibits that they had of the frontier, arguing that they were misleading or exaggerated. And this led to a conference in 2001, and if you're interested in this issue, I suggest you not only read Windschuttle, as you should, and make up your own mind, but you should read the replies of a number of historians, because in all, 15 people gave papers at that conference. And it was a sort of interesting conference because it was sort of going back in a time machine back to the 1970s when people were very interested in the frontier issue. When Aboriginal history was first being written, that was the first question they started to write about. What happened on the frontier? How violent was it? Did Aboriginal people resist, etc., etc.? So the whole papers started to go back to the issue of what did actually happen on the frontier, how do we actually know this, and what can we say about the numbers killed, and how do we remember that? Windschuttle, to give him his due, was present in this very hostile atmosphere. He's a very combative individual, and he has once described himself as a demolition merchant. and he was very happy to be there and tell us that we're all wrong. I actually spoke at the conference. I was asked to speak on the statistics of the death toll, and in that paper I did reject the inordinate claims of journalists, because I think some journalistic writers have made some very extravagant claims about frontier violence and the extent of it and the number of massacres, and I think they've done historical truth a disservice, and they've made very easy targets of themselves for people like Windshuttle, who then pick their exaggerated claims off and treat them as straw men to beat the rest of us. But certainly by looking at the Victorian evidence, which I know best, I tried to show in my paper, I hope successfully, and you can read it if you like. I could even put it up on WebCT if you'd like to read it. Just tell me if you would. That I refuted claims of sloppiness by looking at the very impressive work of some historians in Victoria, people like Ian Clark up at Ballarat has done fantastic work on Aboriginal European violence, and also Bev Blaskett has done some great work. And in fact, you can see that historians, when you look closely, disagree with each other like crazy. There's not collusion going on that Windshuttle talks about. Historians are very willing to dispute each other's findings and to attack even people like Henry Reynolds, the great father of Aboriginal history, comes in from a lot of stick by historians who say that, you know, he's too general, or he doesn't do this or doesn't do that. But I argued in the paper too that despite all the difficulties of trying to get to an exact count of the numbers of Europeans or Aboriginal killed on the frontier, that the public, the reading public, we all want to have a generalisation. We don't like people who say, well, I've studied this for 20 years, but I can't really say generally how many it might have been. That's unacceptable. We wouldn't tolerate that. We want to say to people, well, give us a number. And so people have come up with the statistics we have. But Windshuttle was very artful. He said, look, I used to think that Henry Reynolds' number of 20,000 was true, and now I find it's an estimate. And he made a great thing out of attacking that. Well, Henry Reynolds never said it was true. If you go back to Henry Reynolds' words, or you go back to my words in 1981 and 1982, we can say the best estimate or the best guess is. So, you know, even though Windshuttle talks about Aboriginal historians as lying or colluding or fabricating, he does a fair bit of that himself in his attacks on them. So his response at the conference and in other things was that the evidence has been doctored and incidents invented. And as I said, he uses extravagant claims of journalists like Knightley, who talked about slavery in Australia and talked about wide-scale genocide in Australia, as easy straw men to knock over and attack us all. And he attacked some historians mercilessly. Lyndall Ryan wrote a very good book called Aboriginal Tasmanians, which came out of her PhD thesis written in 1978, I think it was, or 77, a long time ago, and he attacked her on certain footnotes. Now, she was forced to go back and try and find her notes of 30 years ago and find if she had them and try and sort out what's wrong. Now, all of us make a few errors in footnotes. I bet you even in your essays you make a few errors of footnotes. And when you've got hundreds and hundreds of them in a big book, there are bound to be some slip-ups. These should not happen, but historians are human. But Lyndall Ryan was chased mercilessly by not only Windshuttle, but by journalists who rang up, said to the University of Newcastle, well, are you going to sack Lyndall Ryan? She got some things wrong. Are you going to sack her? You know, very, very vindictive attacks, and it did have an enormous emotional impact on her. But I think we need to recognise that Windshuttle's own historiography is not quite what it is claimed to be. So I've already said that he claims that all historians in Australia that write Aboriginal history are colluding against the truth that he sees. And I think that I've shown that that's a fairly absurd situation. I think also that Windschuttle only writes a particular form of Aboriginal history himself. He only writes about the frontier from one particular perspective. He's interested in numbers. He'll only accept a death if it can stand up in a court of law. And we know that in fact many deaths occurred that were hidden or didn't have the evidence because there weren't people on the frontier seeing everything. But the weight of evidence in all the journals and diaries on government officials and settlers, etc., were this sort of thing was happening. But Windschuttle refuses to accept them if you don't see a body or there's not an inquest. And so he's only interested in this part of the frontier. He's not interested in any other part of frontier history, like the cultural struggles between people, the new things that Aboriginal historians have talked about over the last 25 years. He's not interested in that because I think he's not interested in Aboriginal culture as such. He said things like, for instance, in Tasmania, Aboriginal people were not patriots but criminals because they didn't have a word in their language for land, so therefore they couldn't have been fighting for land, which seems to be rather interesting argument. And he accuses all Aboriginal historians of political bias, but of course has none himself, which I think we would all agree that that's quite an impossibility. We all have a viewpoint. We all have a place from which we're writing. We need to be open about that. We need to be upfront. But any thought that there are things called pure facts is absurd. You know, E.H. Carr, if you want to read a very interesting book, a very slim book, you'll get through it in a couple of hours. E.H. Carr wrote an interesting book called What is History, about 30 years ago, and it still has things to tell us. He says that historical facts are like fish in the sea. They are captured by the fishermen, they're brought into the slab of the fishmonger's shop, and then they're purchased by people and they're taken home and they're either fried, grilled or whatever, or baked. That the facts are always shaped because we don't use all the fish in the sea. We only use particular fish to build our meals. And we only use particular facts to build our historical interpretations. We can't use them all. And we haven't got them all because a lot of them have been lost. So we've got to recognise history is imperfect, but, and therefore we are constructing history out of our own cultural ideas and our own views. But as long as we do it honestly, as long as we do it in an upfront manner, then we do the best we can. But to think that everyone else is biased and he is not is an absolutely intellectually absurd position. But that's the view he takes in taking the high ground. And in fact, at other times he'll admit that his values have shifted, that he was a Marxist in the 1970s. I was at university with him at Sydney University. He was studying for his MA at the time I was doing my postgraduate work. Then he became a social democrat, he said, and he wrote a lot about unemployment, and he tended to move into more sociology than history. And now he's a conservative. He calls it a growing up, as if everyone else has not grown up. So you can see the way he takes the moral high ground. So his view of the frontier is that it wasn't very violent, and that the British brought civilisation and the rule of law to Australia. The Mile Creek did happen, but it was exceptional. You know, it was one of the few instances when such things got out of hand, and of course the guilty were punished. So British law did play a role here. But as I guess you found out, most historians don't share this sort of view. I guess you've got to ask, why is Windschuttle putting forward this view? And I think it's an uneasiness about modern Australia. And he's in fact pushed the attack. He's written another book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, and he's promising yet a further one. Again, that book targets other historians, but also targets Aboriginal people, calling them criminals, not patriots. And there has been responses to that. So if you want to follow it up, you can read The History Wars by Stuart McIntyre. You could read Rob Mann from our own politics department, who's written a book called Whitewash. He was actually thrown out of the editorship of Quadrant over the issue of his interest in the removal of Aboriginal children issue and also the Frontier Wars. Robert Mann, yeah, was thrown out of the... he was the head of Quadrant for about 8 years or so, and was conservative on many issues, but on the Aboriginal issue he wasn't conservative, and therefore he was removed from the editorship. So you'll see that there is a very strong, long debate if you want to get involved in it. If you go to most historical journals of the last couple of years, there will be reviews of Windschuttle's work. And in the historical terrain, he doesn't have many friends. There has been one book by Connor written on the notion of terra nullius, saying that it was never used at the time, so everyone's wrong in using it. And certainly, as I think I've said before, the words terra nullius were not used in the 1780s or 90s, but the idea of wasteland was certainly there. So what's the backlash all about? Well, Anne Curthoys at the conference gave a very interesting paper in which she said that settlers want to see themselves as victims and won't accept that Aboriginal people are victims. And she said there's a long history starting with Exodus in the Bible where settlers are seen as victims. The Israelites left because of famine and went into Egypt. They grew up in numbers and were thrown into slavery by the Pharaoh and therefore had to escape oppression, went to Canaan and took over the land there. And that's the story of their right to be there because of the persecution they've suffered. Well, she said often settlers put this view that they were persecuted and suffered too. The founders of our country, the convicts, were persecuted at home. They weren't really thieves and whatever. They'd just stolen a loaf of bread or a hanky, and they were sent out here and were victims of a vicious system out here. Immigrants, of course, were thrown off their land in England. They were at the bottom of the heap. They were victims too, and they came out to found a new society. So that the pioneer legend, the Australian legend, is a legend of battlers. These people had tough times at home, they left, and then they have to struggle since then as battlers. And she argues that the threats to land in the 1990s are a threat to the supplanting society's legitimacy on holding the land. In the era of Aboriginal land rights, settler society is getting nervous that they don't have legitimate claims to the land, so they want to see themselves as victims and they won't accept Aboriginal people as victims. And that's why there's the whole issue of who should define Australia's past. And in the history wars, often the attack was made on the historians as a cultural elite. The Chardonnay set who don't know what they're talking about, and it really should be the people who decide the memories of the past. So when we think about Mile Creek, it really is part of a very complex and long issue. And there are memories about it too, not only what happened at the time, and we'll be talking about that in tutorials, but what have people made of it since? And some very interesting changes. When Bob Rees went back to the area where the Mile Creek happened in the 1970s and asked Aboriginal people, he got very little response. There was almost an indifference to the whole issue, saying, well, these things happen. But you've got to wonder, I suppose, whether they actually told him what they really felt. You know, a researcher breezes in and asks, well, what do you think about this? Do they really talk about it much? And even the white memories in the area, there are memories and stories about massacres there. And what does that mean for them? Is it about, well, this is regretful that this happened, or is it about a more deeper thing, a shame or a guilt? And I'll hopefully show you a very interesting video at the end of this unit, which is about the Mile Creek as it's been remembered by both sides in a reconciling feeling in 2001. And it's a very interesting thing. It's called Bridge Over Mile Creek. So we've got all going to have our own personal thoughts and memories of frontier violence, and I guess we need to come to terms with that when we're trying to discuss the history. So I'll leave it there, but what I want to show you is about 17 minutes of a video, so just have a short break and we'll watch this short bit of the video. Thanks.